Hey guys, David here. One of the things that I do is I speak to passive investors like yourself very often. And one of the common questions I get is investors who, ask about the terms we use on a daily basis for passive investing. And one of the things I wanted to do is bring on Michael Blank here. And he's going to basically, break down some of these terms, these essential terms that you need to know if you're going to start passively investing. And Michael, could you tell me a little bit about some common terms that we use?
Yeah, so one of the things that we get a lot is, my gosh, what's this thing called an LP and a GP, right? Like, who are the roles in the syndication? That's certainly one of them. And so let me break that down. We're going to talk about other things like average annual return, cash on cash, and a few other things that, that come up a lot. And people are like, what are these things? These are not familiar terms. So let's talk first about this LP and GP thing. There's really two main roles inside a syndication. So a syndication has general partners and limited partners. So general partners are the operators. Those are the people who find the deal, raise the money, hire the management, just run the day-to-day operation. And the limited partners are essentially the passive investors. And the reason it's called limited is because their exposure is limited to the amount of money that's invested. Now you could say, well, what kind of exposure is there? I can lose all my money. Yes. But as a general partner, their exposure is lawsuits, is unlimited, right? They get a $10 million lawsuit, they got to deal with that. The limited partner, the law protects the limited partner because they have a limited operational capability. They're kind of more passive, and the general partners really call it day-to-day shots. So the limited partner doesn't have a lot of control. They may have voting rights in some things, but they have limited control. So the law protects them from some of these lawsuits as well. So those are the two different roles, as kind of the active investor, the operator, the GP, general partner, and then the limited partner are kind of the passive investors.
For me, in my calls, I've found that a lot of investors struggle to differentiate between a couple of essential metrics that we use: IRR, or internal rate of return, and AAR, which is average annual rate of return. Can you break down these terms a little more?
Yeah, we typically, the average annual return is much simpler to talk about. And so therefore we talk about the average annual return, sometimes interchangeably with IRR, though that's technically not correct. But the average annual return is, let's say an investment has 10% average annual return. So if you invest $100,000, you expect to get 10% over the 5-year period back, right? So $10,000 a year times 5 is $50,000 that I expect to get back. That's a very simple mathematical calculation. And we like to keep things simple, David. The IRR is a mathematical way of actually measuring the return of an investment. It's kind of the apples to apples comparison, because it accommodates the inflows and outflows of money. It accommodates the passing of time, because money in my hands right now is worth more than the same amount of money 5 years from now. So it accommodates that as well. The problem with the IRR is that's very complicated to explain, certainly without a spreadsheet. Now, the Excel spreadsheet has a function in it called IRR that calculates the IRR out of inflows and outflows. So, for example, the average annual return is much easier to calculate. But let's say you do a cash out refinance and you return in year 3 the entire principal that they invested. Well, now year 4, any kind of cash on cash return you get is infinite. Well, how do you calculate the average annual return on something that's infinite? Well, you can't. Therefore, the average annual return, as simple as it is, has shortcomings. The IRR, however, does calculate the internal rate of return of money coming in, money coming out, money coming in. And so therefore, if you want to compare any investment, whether it's stocks, gold, oil, syndications, anything, and you want to actually compare them apples to apples, the IRR is the way to do that. But it's much more complicated.
So I want to take this a step further and kind of tie these concepts together, talk about equity splits, how those relate to LPs and GPs, as this is fundamental to understanding the returns for any given syndication. What are equity splits, and what kind of equity splits can investors expect to receive?
So the equity split is the following. So you have, remember, the GPs and LPs we talked about before. So even though the LPs are putting up 100% of the money, they don't actually own 100% of the deal. They own maybe 70% or 80% or 75%. And the GPs, the operators, own the remainder. So let's say you have an 80-20 split or a 70-30 split. So the LPs, the investors, own 70% in return for putting up all the money. And the GPs, the operators, get 30% of the equity in return for doing all the work, essentially. That's kind of like their compensation for that. So those are the equity splits, and they vary widely, honestly, David. I mean, it depends. Typically, as the deals are smaller, the equity splits might be 60-40, 60 going to the investors, 40 to the operator. As deals get larger, they might be closer to 80-20. So it really depends on how the splits are, and investors looking at deals shouldn't really be focused and fixated on the equity splits. They should be focused on the returns that are being projected and what the assumptions are that are behind those returns. Because I can make a spreadsheet do anything I want. I can have an average annual return of 20%, but I can make outrageous assumptions on the back end to get those numbers, right? So you're really looking at the returns, but also you're looking at the underwriting assumptions, and what the equity splits are really is secondary. But typically, they're typically between 70-30 and 80-20.
Now, another aspect of equity splits that you briefly touched upon is the concept of preferred returns. Can you delve into that a little? What are preferred returns, and what are some of the challenges that GPs face when they provide preferred returns?
Yeah, preferred equity or preferred return is simply where the investor gets a certain percentage paid out first before a profit split. Think of it more like for example, an interest, a loan on an interest. So let's say if there's a preferred rate of return of 8%, then any kind of cash flow, you have this bucket of cash flow that's waiting to be distributed, then the first 8% of equity that was invested is distributed first to the investor, right? So let's say there's $1 million of equity in the deal from investors, right? Then the first $80,000 of that is distributed to the investors. And then what's left is then distributed based on the equity splits, 80-20, 70-30. So that's what the preferred equity is. Now, investors love this because they kind of get paid first, right? It makes a lot of sense before the profit. So it's kind of like more of a guaranteed payment. It's not really any guarantee, but it's kind of like the more guaranteed part of the payment, and the profit is kind of gravy. Now here is why we don't do it. We've never done it, and we hopefully never will. But there's a reason that operators do this, and that is because it's easier to raise money. Because investors love the word, preferred, because they get paid first. Now, philosophically, it might make sense to say the investor should get paid before the operator. And I actually agree philosophically with that as well. The investor has to get paid first, which is also why if there's a cash out refinance or sale or anything like that, investors always get paid first. But there's a dark side of the preferred return. It goes something like this. The dark side of preferred return is, let's say the deal doesn't go quite as planned. Let's say the property manager the operator hires doesn't actually do what they say they're going to do, and you lose a year or even 18 months, and you got to fire them and replace you. So now they're behind the 8 ball. Meanwhile, they have an 8% return they have to pay out, and the cash flow does not exist to pay this out. So there's this what's called a deficiency. That deficiency is accrued and defers to the next year. So you can't pay out the 8% that you're owed to the investors. So it rolls over to the next year. Now, the second year, you owe 16% of equity to the investors. Now, maybe by this point you've improved it a little bit and you're able to distribute maybe 2 or 3%, but now you're still 13% in the hole. So that 13% now rolls over into third year. Okay, you see where I'm going with this, David? And the operator never gets out of the deficiency. And if that happens, two things can happen. Number one, at one point, they're like, well, this is for the birds. I'm handing the keys back to the bank. Here you go, bank. I can't do this. I can never get over this hurdle I created for myself. You take it from here, which of course is very bad for the investor. The second thing that can happen, which is more likely to happen, is the operator tries to sell the deal because they can never overcome the deficiency they built for themselves out of cash flow. The only way they can ever get paid, ever, is by selling it through profit. Now, doing that may not serve the investor because the maximum IRR return might be achieved after a hold of 5 years, not after a hold of 2.5 years. So in other words, it actually it forces the operator to make poor decisions that are actually not in the best interest of the investor. Therefore, our philosophy is that, hey, if we're making money, we should all make money. If we're not making money, no one's making money. Right? And so this is why we don't do preferred returns. And some operators have done returns, and some of those operators are now backpedaling and now trying to undo that for the same reason I just mentioned.
All right, Michael, appreciate your explanation on that. I think that's going to go a long way in terms of helping a lot of investors, clear up some misconceptions they may have or some misunderstandings. Now, if you're interested in passive investing and want to discuss some more of these metrics we use or get an explanation of, any other sort of syndication terms that we use, please go to www.themichaelblank.com/get the guide and check out the ultimate guide to passive investing. Thanks, guys.